What follows is a demonstration of how to build the rig for the Seaweed assignment. This is a fairly simple rig, just a handful of joint chains and a single poly mesh, but we'll be using a number of tools to build this character rig. This is quickly demonstrated, but rest assured that you can pause the video and go over it again and again if there's anything that you missed. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do, and I do this anytime I'm creating an asset, is I'm going to go ahead and say File, New Scene. Don't save the one I'm on. And then I'm also going to say File, Save Scene As, and I'm going to name this scene as the asset that I'm creating. Now, because I'm creating an asset, I'm going to put it in the Assets folder, and I'm going to go ahead and call this scene Seaweed Rig V01. And I'm going to save it as a my.ascii file. Now, even though there's nothing in the scene, I'm doing this so that every time I hit Control S to save, I'm saving sort of based on this file name. So it's a good idea to start right at the beginning saving this empty scene. Now, the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to build the rig from an orthographic side view, because that's how I'm going to be presenting this animation. So the first thing I need is some geometry, and I'm going to go ahead and create a polygon primitive sphere and use this as the basis of my rig. Now I'm going to click on the option box for this sphere, and it's going to pull up some options here in terms of the number of divisions, both vertically and horizontally. As I create this thing, I'm just going to take the defaults as they are, create, but I can easily go into the attribute editor and change this sphere that I've created. So if I do Control A and I go into this first tab here, the sphere shape, this one right here, you can see those same attributes here on that sphere. And let me frame it up for a sec so you can see if I increase the subdivisions, the number of lines increase. So I'm just going to start with a 10 by 10 sphere to begin. Now the first thing that I want to do is sort of get my geometry lined up so that it's sort of oriented and positioned well for the character rig. So I'm going to take it and using my scale tool, hitting the R key to select that scaling tool. I'm going to flatten it a little bit, like a blade of seaweed. I'm going to elongate it a bit, and I'm not being super precise here. I could be more precise and say, you know, let's elongate it 5 times and 0.1 time thickness. I'll do 0.2 times thickness, so it's got some thickness here, and that's starting to get the shape of the seaweed blade that I want. The next thing I'm going to do is move it up so that the bottom of it is touching origin. So in this case, I'm going to move it up 5 units. And you'll see now its base is touching the origin. I'm going to hit the 3 key so that with my geometry selected, it turns on smoothing so I can see what the actual final result will look like as I smooth this thing. Now I want a little bit more detail on the vertical here. So I'm going to hit Control A to pull up the attribute. Well, I've got this geometry selected, make sure I'm on this 3rd channel. And I'm just going to say subdivision height, and I'm going to add, I don't know, let's go 14 subdivisions. That should be plenty for what I want. The sort of wrap subdivisions probably doesn't need to be at 10. I'm going to see if I can simplify that a little bit. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to keep my geometry as simple as possible so this rig is nice and light. I'm going to go with 8 and 14. I think that should be plenty of detail for this character rig. Now that I've got that, I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to do a couple of little things to sort of add some variation to the shape of this this geometry. But before I do that, I want to kind of lock in the position that it's at, and I also want the pivot point of the geometry to be down at origin. So I'm going to go Modify, Freeze Transforms, and you'll see now the scale and all the attributes are back to the. And I'm also going to say Modify, Reset Transforms, and that'll put the origin back on the ground plane. So now you can see the pivot point of this geometry is at the base. Okay, and then finally I'm just going to call this Seaweed Geo, like that. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Now I'm going to modify this a little bit, and I'm going to do this from my orthographic side view. And if I just tap my space bar, that'll maximize this view. I'm going to right-click over this geometry with it selected, and I'm going to go to Vertex. And that'll pull up all of the vertexes of this geometry so I can move them individually. Now if I double click on my my move manipulator, double click here on my move tool, you'll see one of the options I have is soft selection. If I turn that on, you'll notice that when I grab individual points and move them, lots of things can move along with it, and I can adjust how wide an area that soft select affects and how quickly it falls off. Now in this case I'm going to be doing some really hard changes, so I'm going to turn off soft select, but I just wanted you to know about that function. So I'm just going to pull this point up a little bit. I'm going to grab those points through there like this. I'm going to grab these points here a bit. I'm just going to carve some shapes here and kind of get something a little more organic looking on my seaweed. Give it a unique sort of feel and flavor. Now you may want to hit 4 for wireframe as you're manipulating this seaweed, so you can kind of see that you're grabbing both points on the sides here. And I'm just going to pull these up and get a few cut-ins like this. Just get something a little more organic looking, like that. That's good. And I also want to get sort of a more pointed shape at the top, so I'm going to pull this up a little bit, pull these points up a bit, stretch it out a little bit. There we go. That's better. I feel like that's a more natural looking piece of seaweed. There. Hit 5 for shaded mode, and if I right click over it now and just go back to object mode, I'm back to my normal manipulation of the seaweed. If I turn on wireframe on shaded, I can see that wireframe even as the character is shaded. Oops, don't need that tool set anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. So that's the first part. I've got my geometry, and if I go Window, Outliner, you can see the seaweed geometry is there. I'm going to go ahead and create a display layer with that seaweed geometry selected. I just click here and say Create Layer from Selected, and I'm going to call this Geo, like that, and I'll just give it a color like this and go Save. And I can hit here and toggle it visible and invisible. I can make it, you know, sort of a template where I can sort of see the wireframe outline of it, but not the actual shaded, or I can hit reference where I'm going to go ahead and shaded, but I can't select it. This is going to be useful later. I'm going to go ahead and create a display where, okay, now that I've got my geometry, I want to go ahead and create the joints that I'm going to use to skin this geometry. And because we're doing a sort of an S-curving type assignment, I know that I need at least 4 points of articulation to go up the length of it here. And what I'll do is I'm going to make sure I'm in rigging mode, and I'm going to go to skeleton, create joints, and I'm just going to pull up the option box here. And truthfully, all of these default options are going to work fine for me. So now I'm in the skeleton mode tool, and I'm going to hit 4 so I can sort of see this skeleton get drawn. And I'm going to click down at the base. Now, just to make sure that I'm keeping it right on the dead center axis line, I'm going to turn on snap to grids so that each joint that I draw snaps to the nearest grid point. So I'm going to click at origin, and I'm going to click sort of just, I don't know, a quarter of the way up, and I guess I'll do here and here and here. And then now that I've drawn all my joints, I'm just going to right click, oops, sorry, not right click, silly Dave. I'm going to go ahead and click my select tool to exit that skinning tool. And so you can see here I've drawn some joints. I've got my joint here at the base, and if I rotate you can see all the joints go with it, and each subsequent joint down the length like that. Now to make my life a little easier so those joints are sort of evenly spaced, that each one's the same length, I'm going to select them, and you can see translate 3, translate 3, translate 2, translate 3. So I'm going to make these all sort of even lengths, and I'm going to turn off that snapped grid. So I'm going to just say, let's grab these joints and say, I don't know, 2.6. Looks like 2.7. I want to get a value that just puts that end 2.8. Yeah, it looks like 2.7. Sort of gets gets each of those joints evenly spanned, and my end joint is right at the tip there. Okay, and I'm going to call this one base JNT, and I'm going to call this segment 1 JNT, seg 2 JNT, and these names are arbitrary, but the JNT highlights that it's a joint, so that if I'm ever searching, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab the top node and just do Control G, and I'm going to call this skin joints, like that. Now, I'm not going to want to be animating on joints directly, so I'm going to also need some NURBS curves to create some animation controls. So I'm going to go ahead and say create NURB primitive circle, and I'll rotate this circle 90 degrees in Z just so I can see it, and I'm going to call this CNTRL for control, and I'm going to go ahead and pull up the attribute editor, Control A, and go to Object Display, and under Drawing Overrides I'm going to say enable those overrides, and I'm going to change the color of it to yellow, something nice and bright that I can see in my interactive view. So there's my first control. Now I'm going to go ahead and take that control, and I'm going to say Control D to duplicate to make another control, and this one I'm going to keep flat, and I'm going to move it up a bit just so I can sort of see it. This first control I'm going to say modify freeze transforms, modify reset transforms. So now its position sort of on the side here is its default position. That's what I want. And I'm going to grab this control here, and let me just go to an interactive view, and I can just sort of tap my spacebar to go back to my 4-panel here. And I'm going to tap my spacebar to go to my interactive 3D view. Let me just orbit around for a second. I'm going to go ahead and just do a little modification on this ring so it's sort of more easy to see from all angles. I'm going to go right-click over it. Oh, whoops, I've got the joint selected. I'm going to right-click over this and say Control Vertex. I'm going to go like this. I'm going to grab those two and these two here. I'll move all 4 of those down. So here I get a sort of zigzaggy shape like that. And then I'm going to right-click and go back to object mode. And so the reason I did that is now if I go to an orthographic view here, you can see it's just a little easier to see that curve, and if I'm in a perspective view, I can sort of see that curve nicely, that shape from different angles like that. Plus, I don't know, it just kind of feels wavy like a piece of seaweed, so I kind of like it. I'm going to call this one base control, and I'm going to call this one SEG segment 1 control, like that. And you can guess from my skin joints, seg 1, 2, 3, and let's see, 3, and this one I'm going to call end joint, like that. I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate these controls. Control D for seg 2. Get rid of that. Control D again for seg 3. Like that. And now you can see if I just take these controls and sort of move them out, there's like that. So I've got my first controller here, second, third, fourth, like that. I've got my base, and then 1, 2, and 3, like this. And you'll recognize this is sort of an upside down pendulum. Now, to make life easy, I want to have these NURBS curves controlling these joints. And so the easiest way for me to do that is just to put these controls underneath the joints. So I'm going to take this first base joint, and I'm just going to middle mouse drag and drop it onto the base joint there. And then I'm just going to go 0 like that. Oh, interesting. I thought I zeroed out that control, but let me go modify freeze transforms. Make sure that's at 0. Let me check that these guys are all frozen as well. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and drag segment 1 under segment 1, segment 2 under segment 2, segment 3 under segment 3, like that. And the reason I'm doing this is just so that if I grab these joints and zero them out, they should snap to the same location as the joints that they're going to be controlling. Like that, and like that. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I zero out these controls here. I'm going to grab them all, and I'm just going to say, not the base, just these three here, and I'm going to go modify freeze transforms, and just to get rid of that 90-degree rotation. So now I've got my joints, and there's my 3 joints, and then I've got these 3 segments here. Now I'm going to reorganize the hierarchy a bit, because what I want to have happen is if I manipulate the base control, I want the 3 subsequent controls to move with it. So I'm going to go like this. I'm going to say, hey, base joint, I want you to be a child of the base control. And I actually have to sort of do that like this, where I take the base control and I drag it under skin joints, like that. And then I take base joint and put them underneath base control, like that. And then I'm going to do the same thing here, where I take segment 1 control and I put it under base joint. And then I take segment 1 and put it as a child of the controller, like that. And so on and so forth. So you can see me just dragging these parts around. So I'm going to grab the next control, segment 2, put it here, oops, under segment 1, and then put the joint underneath the control. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab this last control and put the joint underneath it, like that. So you basically have control, joint, control, joint, control, joint, control, joint, like that. That way, if I grab the base control and rotate it, you'll notice that all of the joints move along. And if I grab the next control and rotate it, everybody moves along, and so on and so forth, which is what I want. Now I'm going to call this here, actually I'm going to change this to Seaweed Rig, like that. Now what I want to do is I want this geometry to deform to follow these joints. So I'm going to grab the base joint, segment 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to bother with the end joint. I'm not actually going to use him for skinning. And then once I've grabbed those joints, the last thing I do is I grab the geometry. And I'm going to go skin, bind skin, and I'm going to open up my bind skin options. Now I'm going to say bind to selected joints only, closest distance. I'm just going to use a classic linear and interactive, but I'm going to make sure that the maximum number of influences are just 2. I don't want a really complex skinning scenario, and I'm just going to go bind skin. Now you'll notice that if I grab the base control and rotate it, the skin comes along for the ride. If I scale that joint, the seaweed scales with it. And each subsequent control, if I rotate it, the character rotates along like that. Now the last thing I want to do is, you can see these controllers here, they have values on them. I'm just going to go ahead and zero out those controllers. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that if I hit 0 on the translate X, the controller, if it's zeroed out, it will stay in its position. So I'm going to go modify freeze transform. Oh, I can't do it because the skin is bound. Silly Dave. Yeah, I forgot about that. So I'm just going to leave it as is. Now, these segments, I don't want to translate them. I only want to rotate this character. So I am going to select the translates of all of these segment controls, and I'm going to say lock and hide selected. I also don't really foresee that I want to be scaling the seaweed asymmetrically, where I scale different parts of it. So I'm also going to lock and hide the scaling of those joints like this. Lock and hide selected. So that all I'm left with is the rotational values. And if I wanted, I could even go so far as to say, hey, I'm only going to be animating this from a side view. So in this case, my panel orthographic side. in which case you can see here I want to be rotating this controller here on the y-axis, this controller on the y-axis like that, and so on and so forth. I don't want to be twisting it or anything, so I'm actually going to take all of these controls and I'm going to lock rotate X and rotate Z and hide it. So again, lock and hide selected. So now if I select one of these controls and rotate, the only way it rotates is side to side, like that. And now you can see I've got the beginnings of my rig. Now I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take the geo and the rig, and I'm going to do Control G to group it, and I'm going to call this Seaweed, like that. And so underneath Seaweed there's Seaweed Geo and Seaweed Rig. And you can see under the Seaweed Rig there are these controls with each joint underneath it. If I want to move the entire character, I just grab this base control and I translate it around like that. This top node, the Seaweed top node, I don't want to move it because you can see it messes up if I shift that thing. So I can also take this top node, I can grab all of the attributes here and say lock and hide selected. So this node stays at origin, and the only way that I move the character is by grabbing this base control and moving around there. Last thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that when I'm animating I can't see those joints. Now unfortunately if I grab the joints individually and I try and add them to a layer, you'll see that it also hides the controls. So that's not going to work for me. Now I could have built this rig with the joints and the controls separately and use constraints to drive them, but that makes things a little more complex, and I want a nice, light, simple rig. So I'm going to just leave it like that, and all I do is I say show, and I turn off joints when I'm animating so that I don't see them. And I can also go ahead and under my selection masking here turn off the selectability of joints so that even if I have joints visible, I can't select them. I can select geometry, but I can't select the joints themselves. Now of course I'm going to toggle my geo to be a reference. So I can't select my joints, can't select my geo. All I can select is the animation controls, and they only rotate on one axis, and that means now I can animate this seaweed and get this nice twisting shape like that for the seaweed assignment. And that's it. It's a pretty straightforward rig. There's not a whole lot to it, but you can see it's pretty easy to get some nice results. Now later on we'll talk a little bit about how we can modify some of this skin weighting to get softer curves and things like that, but for the most part you'll find that the default smooth binding options are going to give you a good result. And if I hit 0, it resets the character back to his default position. I am going to go ahead and on this base control here, I'm not intending to actually move this character rig, so I am going to go lock and hide selected on the translates as well, just so I don't accidentally move him. Now if for some reason you accidentally lock and hide the wrong channel, remember, if you go Window, General Editor, Channel Control, that'll allow you to go and sort of find those channels and unhide them. So let's say for example, oh, I want to be able to move the translates on the character. Then I'm going to go to my locked, and here's my translates, and I'm going to say, hey, move these to non-locked, and then I'm going to go to keyable, and I'm going to see my translates down here, translate X, Y, and Z, and I say, hey, just move them over here so now they're keyable and visible, and lo and behold you'll see them show up in the channel box. And that's it. This is the Seaweed rig that we need to build for the Seaweed assignment. Now your blade will look very different, but essentially you want something that's, about 5 times as long as it is wide. You don't want it to be sort of thick and round so that when you're looking at it in shaded mode you can see it's a flat blade like kelp or something like that. And that's about it. Follow along with the demonstration. Try and build your own version of this character rig, and if you're having trouble, just remember to go back through the steps and pause and watch very carefully, and you can see there's not a whole lot to this rig. And that's it.